Chapter 20, the final chapter. Woo, right? You're pretty much done. This is the chapter about contemporary art. And for me, it's my favorite, of course, because it is my specialty. Um, Funny enough, I usually teach this in about a month in art history too. So the fact that I have to shove all these movements into one chapter makes me just laugh with hilarity sometimes. My point being that there's a lot of movements covered in this chapter. You definitely should do more research if you want to know more about them because some of the discussion is kind of cursory, it's kind of quick. It really tries to cover 1960s till today in one chapter, which is a little ludicrous, but that's what happens. The first movement that's covered in the chapter is pop art. Pop art comes from the idea of popular art and sort of got shortened down to pop. And this Calvin and Hobbes kind of gets into what is pop art really about. Artists started to consider, could you take something like a comic and make that into art? In a sense, is it art, right? And it's about this question of what is high art? What is low art? And is there really such a thing? I'm a pretty open-minded person about these things. I really don't like the high art, low art categorizations. To me, everything's art. If you want to say it's art, hell, it's art. What do I care? So to me, saying something's high because it's a sculpture or painting, or it's low because it's a quilt or like a comic, I really don't buy into this. But I know a lot of art historians who are kind of snobbish about such matters. So there's different attitudes about how do you categorize these type of things, right? And so pop really tried to consider, what if you made art that's about things that people understood and already were familiar with? And so you'll notice it's very consumer object oriented. And it's a post-World War II movement. It's sort of utopian in its attitude. So again, if you use historical context, you're coming off this very damaging World War. You're looking at the 1940s, right, being a very damaged time. And you're thinking about how people want to turn the corner and they want to have things that are fun or things that are accessible around them. They want to be happy, right? They want to have cars and homes. And so pop feeds into that a bit. And also pop artists really started to think about how we respond to advertising, how we respond to buying, and started to use this idea of, what do people really want? What do they react to? And shouldn't I make art about that? A lot of artists like Warhol and Oldenburg that you see here, they start to talk about, people have short attention spans. Oh, Lord, would they agree with that now? I'm sure you would agree. They did a recent study that if you want to post a video online, it can't be more than 3 minutes. That's about all. These videos are probably trying your patience because they're longer than 3 minutes, right? Sometimes they're 8 minutes, right? But our attention spans, aren't very long. And so Warhol, Oldenburg, Lichtenstein, they said, we should make things that are, people see it and they go, I get it. I get what that is. And so they turned to things like comics, or in this case with Oldenburg, junk food, right? Think of McDonald's. Everyone knows McDonald's. Everyone knows hamburgers and French fries. Things that you don't have to think too much about. It is worth mentioning that abstract expressionism came right before this. So that was a very cerebral movement. That was a very, sort of interior movement. You had to think about what those artworks are about. Pop's like, nope, don't need to think, it's just stuff you know. Oldenburg was a fun guy. He died recently, but really up until the end, he was making artworks. When his early days, he actually rented storefront space in New York and made what was literally a store, and you could buy the artworks inside that looked like ice cream cones and pieces of cake. And there's something so just whimsical about it and cute about it that I don't know about you, but I just love pop. I think it's a lot of fun. Who doesn't love like a pleather, French fries and ketchup? Come on, this stuff is awesome. Vinyl toilets, right? Cigarette butts. He became more well-known later on for his larger scale projects like you see here. And cities all over the world would commission him to come and make these pieces. I especially like the shuttlecocks because I love how the Nelson Atkins Museum is this very traditional neoclassical building. And then you have this whimsy of the dropped shuttlecocks. If you don't know what a shuttlecock is, you use it to play badminton, right? So you hit it with a racket right over a net. So it always looks to me like a bunch of giants, abandoned their badminton game, right? But people commission these. I always think because we find joy in them. Art that brings us joy and laughter. That's sort of what it does. So it appeals to us. It makes sense to us. And so I think that's why pop like this works. Roy Lichtenstein is also a very well-known pop artist. He was mostly known for comics and using comics. So you notice with his pieces, they're all like comic book inspired. He even created silkscreen prints that use what looks like the comic book printing method, which is the Ben-Day dot print method. You'll notice these little tiny dots, or if you take a newspaper and lean up really close and look, has this little dots like to how it's printed. So he even went so far as to try to adopt like the look of the way that comics were printed and use that right in his silkscreen prints. Notice that I'm mentioning silkscreen printing here. He and Warhol both use silk screens. Here's a great Lichtenstein at the New Orleans Museum of Art outdoor sculpture that plays on the idea of brushstrokes and the popness of the brushstrokes. But Warhol, with the last artist I'll show you here, they both use silkscreen. I think that pop artists started to think about, if you're going to make art about commercialness, then you should use a commercial method. So silkscreen printing, you can make multiples. So right there, they're thinking more about like the industry of art making. Warhol was actually critiqued for that quite a bit because he used a bunch of assistants. He actually had a whole place that they hung out called the Factory. And a lot of his artwork was made by assistants. And so a lot of people say, if you have a Warhol, do you really have a Warhol? And I'm like, well, of course you have a Warhol, because that's the way he wanted them made. He wanted you to question the idea of, is it about my idea or is it about my hand touching it? He's completely renovating what it means to be an artist, as Lichtenstein did as well. But Warhol, of course, is famous for his soup cans that you see show up in all of his pieces. Why soup cans? I would argue, first off, he loved Campbell's soup. So if you know his biography, he ate Campbell's soup every day for lunch. He was very had a schedule. He followed it, a little OCD perhaps. So this was a consumer product he was attached to, but he also understood that you would know what it is. I don't think there's anyone I've showed this to who would be like, I don't know what I'm looking at. I'd be like, Campbell's soup. Like, haven't you seen it in a store? The idea that we all know this, and within 2 seconds, we're all like, oh yeah, I know what this is, right? Warhol's known for quotes like, everyone will have, their 15 minutes of fame, right? In the future, like everyone's gonna know people based on what they buy. So he was very much ahead of his time. Today, he wouldn't be surprised, I think, about like the Kardashians and people who are famous for being famous. He was very interested in like how obsessed we were with celebrity and consumerism and kind of the idea that what we buy defines us. Think about just the question of, do you buy brand name or do you buy generic? And that for a lot of people, they're one or the other, and they don't think that you can be both, right? Like, oh, I only buy Campbell's soup. I would never buy Publix soup, So think about how we define ourselves by the consumerist choices that we make. It's quite compelling to consider.